And then you feel like me. Ever since you went away.
So it is February 12th, 2018. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people. We'll look back at our glorious intergrave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and I look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and simulcast and rebroadcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tandanega. You can find our audio streaming at www.ltnradionet.com, and of course, we are streaming live on Facebook. We post the shows afterwards, both on SoundCloud for the audio, and we make sure that the audio is reposted on Facebook, and by tomorrow we'll have it up on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. If you're not catching us live, if you want to catch it after the fact, our YouTube channel is one of the best ways to catch not only the videos of our shows, but some of the special videos that we do specifically addressing many of the issues, some of the issues that I plan to address tonight. Look, the opening song was Since She Went Away. It's a song by Murray Porter that was dedicated to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that is going to be it was primarily going to be the message that I wanted to speak of today on the program. On Wednesday, which is some people would regard as Valentine's Day, February 14th, is a day that many of us have assigned as an awareness day for missing and murdered Indigenous women. I know a lot of my friends like Tara Pertenziegel and Bridget Tolley and others are involved in vigils that are happening across the U.S. and Canada on either side of the imaginary line, as I call it, to bring in speakers and even a couple of performers and folks that'll shed some light on what the issue is. I think many people are unaware that we have such a high level and underreported, but even the ones that are reported are just an extremely high level of Native women who turn up missing. And they are not properly investigated. They are written off as either runaways or any number of things. And we'll get into some of that stuff as the show goes on. But even the women who are discovered, murdered or deceased, oftentimes those deaths are written off as suicides when clearly they are not, and or they're left just under investigated, and that's the reality of life for many Native people and the perils of being an Indigenous woman. And this is regardless of either side of that, which side of that imaginary line you live on, because this is an issue that has raised enough attention on the Canadian side that they've actually launched some investigations, and they're holding some commissions to look at this whole thing, and they're not going well, but the government has been forced to recognize it. On the U.S. side, not so much, although they have tried to make adjustments even when they passed the Violence Against Women Act a few years ago. They tried to make some language appear in that law, as if there has to be a specific law to protect women against violence. It's kind of absurd. But they made some acknowledgments about the violence specifically that takes place against Native women, and the understanding that because they are so grossly under-investigated, so grossly under-resourced, especially on Native territories, where 70% of the violence against women are non-Native perpetrators, that it's left. It's almost, it's almost like it's not a crime if you're a non-Native person to to commit an act of violence against a Native woman because nobody's gonna investigate. Nobody would prosecute. So in the Violence Against Women Act, they tried to do a couple pilot test cases or pilot programs where, for the first time, they would allow Native police, tribal police, and tribal courts. They would allow them to prosecute non-Native perpetrators of this violence. So, yeah, what I'm saying is they couldn't prosecute a white person before this. And this is, kind of what adds to that whole problem, and it exacerbates the overall problem when it comes to really checking out and investigating and prosecuting the crimes that are committed against our women. So on Wednesday, not only are these vigils taking place, but I tried to kickstart a campaign that began a few years ago called the Red Dress Campaign, where people were hanging red dresses, photographing them and posting them up on social media as a specific way to address violence against women. That red dress, that empty red dress, became a symbol of our missing women. And so, it took on some traction. I got a lot of shares off of that, and then I saw other people starting to do more of the same. So my hope is on Wednesday morning, many people will change their profile pictures and I've posted a few. So you want to borrow some of my pictures by all means, but it takes very little effort to simply take a red dress and take a photograph of it. I've recommended that people do perhaps go beyond where I did. I just took some pictures, but perhaps photographing pictures of a red dress in front of a railroad track. We've had many of our women who, like I said, have turned up where they've been disposed of on railroad tracks, and that way they could try to cover up, the abuse that that was perpetrated against them. So the rail system has been part of is an integral part of some of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Taking a photograph in front of or along a riverbank. We've had some of our women wash up on the rivers. Savannah Graywin, for instance. One of the last real big and prominent news cases was Savannah Graywin, who was murdered and had literally had the baby cut out of her womb by her neighbor who lived the next floor up. And they dumped her body. So the rivers become another place where oftentimes, our women who have been missing will turn up, washed up on the shores of a river. So a photograph of a dress at a riverbank along a highway. We hear of the Highway of Tears, which is where so many women turn up missing. As men are heading off to their man camps in these extractive industries, especially on the Canadian side, but not exclusively on the Canadian side. Photographs in front of some of those man camps, photographs in front of police departments, state houses, state legislatures. These are the areas where the crimes that are committed against our women are being protected. The people who commit those crimes are protected by those courts. They're protected by those legislators. They are protected because the way Native people are viewed is shrouded in the racism, the historic racism that has always been perpetrated and inflicted upon Native people. And as the program goes on, I'm not just talking about women either. I would be remiss at this stage of the game, even though on Wednesday we are trying to turn Valentine's Day into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Awareness Day, I would be remiss if I left out the men, especially in light of the verdict that came back last week on the murder of Colton Bushy. I'm not even going to talk about who, I'm not going to give the name of the individual who murdered him. I'm not even going to say his name. I'm not going to give him that notoriety. But a jury comes back and totally acquits this white man who shot a 22-year-old boy in the back of the head. And there's all kinds of stories about, of course, the whole victim shaming. Oh, well, he was a bad kid. He had, a history of this or history. He's 22 years old. And there's nothing that can justify shooting a boy in the back of the head, an unarmed, young man in the back of the head. And of course, he was acquitted. The man was acquitted, basically saying it was an accident. He accidentally shot him in the back. He said the gun just went off. The bottom line is the court system, and this was in Saskatchewan, but it doesn't matter where it is. And I'm going to talk about that racism that is so prevalent, so historic, so systemic. And that is what creates the whole, I hate to even call it an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, because this isn't a pathogen. Racism is a learned behavior. It is not something that somebody catches from somebody. It's not contagious. It's not a biological disorder. It's a mental disorder based on ignorance, oftentimes willful ignorance. But I really do feel compelled to even take this issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and this murder of Colton Bushy and so many others that have, that have been killed, whether you want to talk about Dudley George, you want to talk about Tina Fontaine or Savannah Graywin. I mean, the men who have been killed at the hands of people in power and the racism that is so prevalent in the United States and Canada. And again, I've got to address the Canadian thing, because there is this impression somehow, and we hear it all the time. I mean, all late night, television hosts always talk about how nice Canada is. Every time they have a guest on, isn't Canada so nice? No, it isn't. It is every bit as racist. In fact, Canada has racism that can stand neck and neck with the blatant racism of the deep south of the United States. And if you don't believe me, then I dare you to look up Colton Bushy. Look up any of the Facebook group pages, any of the forums that have talked about the acquittal of his murderer. And you can just go down that list, white man after white man after white man, saying, let an Indian trespass on my land and see what happens. I'd kill him too. They should have killed them all. Even this hippie-looking guy they posted up on Facebook today, who, you think peace, love, and, all that other stuff. This guy's saying they should have killed everybody in the car so nobody would be left to talk about it. I mean, the level of pure hatred that is espoused by people, by white people against Native people, and we'll get into kind of where this comes from, because there's almost this complete disconnect. Because there's this notion, on one hand, look, they want to use Native imagery for mascots. They want to stick a Indian head on the side of a football helmet, or on the front of a hockey jersey, or a cartoon image of a Native person on the front of a baseball cap. So they want to take this imagery and this caricature of who we are and own it. And when I say they, I mean white society, Canada, U.S., doesn't matter. They want to own that and then disconnect that from who we are. So this idea of appropriating an image, however cartoonish it might be, appropriating an image or some sort of character like the noble savage character, and appropriating that from us as a people, and then applying it to themselves so they can somehow represent themselves as noble, as stoic, as brave, as fierce, as strong. All the characteristics that people try to put into their mascot issues, whether it's a bear or a wolf or whatever else. When they use Native people, they bring all this other stuff: nobility, fierceness, savagery. And they take that and they want to own that. But how they view us as a people today is just pure disgust. They loathe who we are today. And you know what? They've always despised us contemporarily. And I say always because I'm going to go back. I'm going to talk about, what was written over 100 years ago. In the contemporary time, we were always despised as a people. But when they look back, they could always embrace us as some noble character that they've somehow supplanted into their history. Ignore our history. Ignore our history, ignore our presence, and ignore our future. That is how you can justify objectifying our women. Sexualizing our women through Disney cartoons and Hollywood films. The idea of sexualizing our young girls to the point where trucker on the highway sees a native woman, and that's like candy. They can just pick it up. And they could disregard, dehumanize us, even as they sexualize our women in their minds. That is how this condition comes to be. It comes from many, many factors. But many of those factors are associated with the idea of dehumanizing us as human beings, as individuals, yet fantasizing about our women and then despising us as men. When we get into the second half of the show, I'm going to read, and I've read the genocide editorials from L. Frank Baum before, but I want to cite some of the specific language that goes to both the idea of almost like this backhanded compliment, like, we're going to heroize what we were, but despise what we are. And how that relates to both the mascot issue, but also relates to the idea of dehumanizing us to the point that you could, that we could be killed without any conscience. Because when you look at the statements that are the posts, the comments that are being made relating to the murder of Colton Bushy, it is really incredible. I don't know anybody who could read those comments and not, if you have a conscience, and not be moved by the callousness of it all. And this idea, no, it's fine to kill Indians. And of course, as a very marginalized people, marginalized in so many ways, especially in terms of population, we are just a small segment of the overall number of people of color who are also dehumanized to the point where our lives become less relevant to the dominant society, to white people. The reason Black Lives Matter is Black Lives Matter is because society says otherwise. And so anybody says, well, all lives matter. Yeah, you know what? White lives have always mattered. Not just to white people, but to the entire system that has been rigged to favor white people. So we don't need to say white lives matter. Yeah, we know that. But what we need to affirm over and over again is that, yes, Black lives matter. And Native lives matter. People of color, we all matter. And it doesn't matter how big the majority is of white people in the United States or Canada, how big that majority is, or if that majority slips into a minority. It doesn't matter how much control white people have over their Congress, over their provinces, over their states, over their corporations, over the media. You're wrong if you're somehow going to relegate people of color into a lesser value or value us in, beneath, less than human. When you hear the language, look, to kill somebody, the standard for killing somebody should be very, very, very high. Yeah, if you believe that there is such a thing as justifiable homicide, if you even believe that, what is that standard? Is that standard just to say, well, He's a native and I'm a white person, so I was justified in killing him. That's the way it is in Canada. And you know what? That's the way it is in the United States too. If you can just look at a person of color and automatically assume that they are, one, a threat to you, one, they are different than you, so they are the other, and by being the other, that they are somehow, it is not proper for them to be in the place that they're at. So part of the idea of killing a native person or a person of color is justifying that they are wrong in some manner, whether they are wrong for being where they're at, not just wrong for what they're doing. And of course, the other justification has to do with white fear of the other. Even for police. I mean, police, they have this standard that says all they have to do is feel like there was a threat. The threat doesn't have to be real. For a police officer to use deadly force against anyone, they only have to perceive a threat. Now, if it's been embedded in you since you were a baby that a person of color is bad, and look, go to the doll test, folks. I'm telling you, go on the internet and look up doll test. You're going to see white kids and black kids, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, being asked to identify the good baby from the bad baby. Even the black children have already been indoctrinated to believing that the white baby dolls are the good baby dolls. Those are the pretty ones. Those are the bad. Those are the good ones. And the black ones are the bad ones, are the ugly ones. That's what they're led to believe. So, knowing that, what do you think happens when those people become adults? And I'm not even just talking about the white kids. Because if you're a person of color and you've been told your whole life that people of color represent the bad part of society, or worse yet, are not even a part of society, that they are beneath that. You know, a black police officer is more likely to kill an unarmed black man than an unarmed white man. Why? Go back to the doll test, folks. Check it out. Go online, look it up. And it's not just what they're taught in school. It's what the media perpetrates. It's what Hollywood films have perpetrated. It's what newspaper articles have perpetrated. What radio theater has perpetrated. It's what is in every magazine. You look at on YouTube videos. It's in song. It's in theater. It's in everything that you can imagine. This notion that people of color are beneath, are less than, are inferior to white people. Once you can look at somebody and think that they are beneath you, that threshold for taking their lives becomes a lot lower, a lot easier to cross. The person who murdered Colton Bushy would not have pulled the trigger on a white man. And all of those comments that are flooding the internet, Facebook and Twitter and forums and for every publication out there talking about this, all of social media, but internet media in general, they're all filled with the same rhetoric. Well, if an Indian was on my land, I'd shoot him too. It's been repeated over. And these are Canadians, folks. But the same thing gets said on the U.S. side. See, when we talk about racism, on the American side, the immediate thing people think is that it's a black-white issue. Native people are almost not even considered a significant part of that conversation. Although there is a clear, unique racism that exists for Native people. Again, the whole mascot issue. Praise the image of a Native person even as you despise what they... Praise the image of a Native history, or what you perceive as the history of a Native person. Praise that. mire yourselves in the characteristics of the noble savage, but hate them as we exist. On the Canadian side, Native people squarely find themselves in the same position as black men in the deep south of the United States. And we see it all the time. And look, if you go to someplace like Winnipeg, most of the homeless people you're going to see are going to be Native. Been there. I've seen it. The images that I saw recently that talked about the alcohol problem in places like Pine Ridge. This idea of seeing a bunch of drunken Indians, that perpetuates that view of who we are. When somebody meets me, it's like, wow, you seem so articulate. You ever heard that said about a black man? Of course you have. Because that breaks the stereotype that white people have of us. I gave an interview in a newspaper a few years ago, and they said I was built like a linebacker but spoke like a college professor. So, I mean, it was like the idea that I could speak articulately was almost, it took the reporter back a little bit. See, that's the reality. We've been cast into this perception that we are the ignorant savage. We were the noble savage, but now we're the ignorant savage. And it's a lot easier to pull the trigger on something that you look as a scourge, as opposed to something of value. Look, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we're going to take a break here. We go back. I'm going to quote a little bit from L. Frank Baum and others, and kind of explain where this comes from and how long it has existed. We'll do that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native.
Comes up on another day. Same faces smiling my same way. I know she feels the same way too. Damn, it's just you. Well, maybe I'm not the romantic kind. No candlelight dinners and no fine French wine. I love you, baby, but I forget to say. I know it's wrong, but I'm just that way. Feel the light, feel the light. Something going on. And I feel like we got trouble in the way. I'm here to tell you it wasn't always this way. You used to call me baby 10 times a day, and now the only call I ever get from you is from the bar. Half past 2. Feel the light, feel the light.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. Need to catch my breath a little bit, and no better way to do that than with a little bit of Murray Porter. So that's why I ask you to indulge me as I indulge you with Murray Porter. Hey, look, I want to give some thanks to my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, good friends like Ed Schindler, Cynthia Trice, Neville Spring, Sugar Montour, and many others who have helped this program continue to educate, entertain, and inform for over 7 years. We're into our 8th year now. I want to thank all of you for joining in the fight and doing your part. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. And again, thank CKWE for the simulcast and rebroadcast of the program. And I also want to thank some of the other networks, Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, Indigenous Resistance Radio. And I want to thank all of you for carrying this show on your networks. And I also want to thank those of you who share the program. And so, many of you share the program both as Facebook live streams on various group pages, my wife in particular. But I also want to thank those of you who share the SoundCloud posts that I put up after the show, the YouTube videos, and of course, I'm not just talking about sharing the show, but sharing many of the issues, the comments, the photos. Obviously, a bunch of you shared some of my missing and murdered Indigenous women photos that I've put up. And of course, I posted a Justice for Colton picture up on my group page as well. If you are not familiar with that, take a look at it. And it is, I post them to be shared. So these aren't things that I'm going to go back and say, hey, what right did you have to take my picture? No, that's what I put them up there for. So I wanted to, again, thank all of you for looking at what I post, considering what the opinion that I offer. Look, I understand that not everybody agrees with me. I get that. And I'm not looking to indoctrinate anybody. I'm not trying to push my opinion on people, but what I am trying to suggest is that this opinion exists. And that it isn't just my opinion. I'm not saying I speak for, any specific number of people or who I represent with the views, but know that this view and this opinion exists, and that there is some foundation and some basis for the opinions that I've drawn from some of this stuff. And I'm going to give you some of that. When people think about history, it's one thing to hear what some native person had to say, somebody who's mired in historical trauma and perhaps has a jaded view of American history or the ideals of Americanism or Americana, all that stuff. But what did the Americans have to say? Well, one of the prominent Americans of his era was a gentleman by the name of L. Frank Baum. L. Frank Baum was the editor of a newspaper called the Saturday Pioneer in Aberdeen, Dakota Territory. But he was actually from central New York. Born in Chittenango, New York, a little village just east of Syracuse, in the heart of what would be considered Oneida territory, I guess. But L. Frank Baum would be the editor of the Saturday Pioneer, and he would write a couple of editorials, many editorials actually, but the two that are actually labeled Baum's genocide editorials. Look them up. You can go online, BAUM, Baum's genocide editorials. I'm going to read just a couple of lines from them. I mean, they aren't that long. The first one, which actually came out, let me see, was first published on December 20th. I'd say that's my birthday, but I wasn't born in 1890. But so December 20th, 1890, it appeared in the Saturday Pioneer, and it was about essentially the murder of Sitting Bull. Of course, it just didn't say that he was murdered; just said that he was dead. It said he was not a chief, but without kingly lineage, he arose from a lowly position to the greatest medicine man of his time by virtue of his shrewdness and his daring. He was an Indian with a white man's spirit of hatred and revenge for those who had wronged him and his. In his day, he saw his son and his tribe gradually driven from their possessions, forced to give up their old hunting grounds and espouse the hard-working, uncongenial avocations of the whites. And these, his conquerors, were marked in their dealings with his people by selfishness, falsehood, and treachery. What wonder that this wild nature, untamed by years of subjugation, should still revolt. What wonder that a fiery rage still burned within his breast, that he should seek every opportunity to obtain vengeance upon his natural enemies. Men don't have natural enemies, by the way. They are created. The proud spirit of the original owners of these vast prairies, inherited through centuries of fierce and bloody wars for their possession, lingered in the last bosom of Sitting Bull. With his fall, the nobility of the redskin is extinguished. Now I'm going to take a break here because this notion that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. That quote is attributed to um, Phil Sheridan, and he is his statue sits at the Capitol in Albany, New York, because I guess he was an Albany native. Sheridan, yeah. He's attributed to that quote, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Now, that can be interpreted two ways. Now, when Sheridan said it, he meant that the only way an Indian was good was if he was dead. That was the language he used. However, there were people like L. Frank Baum who thought, well, there were good Indians, but the good Indians are all dead now. And that's the way he viewed Sitting Bull. So while he espoused the same philosophy that the only good Indians were dead Indians, he didn't mean necessarily that in order to be good, they had to be dead. What he meant, and what he suggests here in this editorial, is that the dead ones were all gone. And what remained were not good Indians. And so here is what he said. After he said that the last, with the fall of the nobility of the redskin extinguished with Sitting Bull, he said, "What few are left are a pack of whining cur who lick the hands that smite them." So then he calls for their annihilation. The best safety of the frontier settlements will be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians. Why not annihilation? Their glory has fled, their spirit broken, their manhood effaced. Better they die than live the miserable wretches they are. History would later forget the latter despicable beings, and speak in later ages of the glory of these grand kings of the forest and plain that Cooper loved to heroism. So there you have it. In 1890, the contemporary view of Native people was that we deserved to be extinguished. Our glory had fled. Our spirit was broken, our manhood effaced, and that we were better off dead so Americans could cherish who we were and not have to deal with who we are. 1890, that was the view. It's still the view today. We cannot honestly regret their extermination, but we at least do justice to their manly characteristics possessed by the early Redskins of America. L. Frank Baum, author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, calling for the extermination of Native people because we were better off dead, with the image of the noble savage in Americana's history, than to live the miserable wretches that they had made us into. So that was the first editorial he'd written, and that was 9 days before the massacre at Wounded Knee. Then he'd follow it up with another editorial. And on one hand, he condemned the massacre, mostly because some white guys got killed in the crossfire. But then he went on to say, the pioneer has before declared that our only safety depends on the extermination of the Indians. Having wronged them for centuries, we had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up by one more wrong and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth. See, again, not people, creatures. Untamed and untamable creatures. So in 1890, going in, and this was actually written in January of 1891. So in the 1890s, it was not a fringe view that Native people should be just killed, exterminated, and that we were beneath contempt, that we were subhuman. Now, the slavery had already been supposedly ended by then. We're talking 1890. We're talking about going into the turn of the century. And of course, even in the turn of the century, we would see the murders of the Osage. And of course, even though slavery had ended, certainly racism hadn't and hasn't. This is the condition that allows for people to be murdered and to be killed without conscience, without regret. This is why missing and murdered Indigenous women is a contemporary issue, because it has a historic foundation. It has a historic foundation in terms of how not just women could be exploited. I mean, this whole notion of, owning a squaw, an Indian princess, all of that stuff. Again, the sexualization of our women from everything from Disney to Hollywood. It is so clear and so perverse. I mean, Pocahontas was 12 years old when she became a subject for white men, for the Jamestown colony. But that's the sexualization of Pocahontas, is to make her as a woman, not as a child, not as a girl. So when you can dehumanize a people, and when you could have done it for centuries. This is Al Frank Baum writing this stuff, folks. This isn't the lunatic fringe of the Deep South. This isn't a plantation owner. This is the editor of a newspaper, born in central New York. This is the view that was held. And you know what? Those comments that I read in those forums relating to the acquittal of the murder of Colton Bushy, they aren't just, ignorant rednecks. It is the general population. It's the rank and file of normal Canadians. Normal Canadians. So the view that is held of Native people by the dominant society, and look, we can back this up a little bit, because, it to some extent, some of this becomes even a numbers game. Again, the unique situation for Native people is that our population has been diminished so significantly by the policies of the United States. I mean, let's be clear. We were the population. We were the population of North America. And by some estimates, there might have been anywhere from 50 to 100 million Native people who lived in this on this continent. Right now, we represent less than 0.7% of the American population, of the U.S. population. A little higher than that, closer to 1% or maybe 2% up on the Canadian side. That's how marginalized we are as a people. There are more Haitian refugees in the United States than there are Native people, indigenous to this land. I mean, that's the truth. I mean, that's not just something being espoused by some radical fringe activist of the Native community. No, that's just truth. So when Barack Obama, so highly regarded as the sensible president, right? Especially compared to what the United States has now. When Barack Obama was asked about teams like the NFL franchise in Washington, D.C., having a racial slur for the name of their team, I'm going to paraphrase, but I'm not going to be too far off. This is what Barack Obama said. He said, if I had a team, and that team had a name that a significant number of people found offensive, I think about changing that name. So 3 hypotheticals. 3 hypotheticals. If I had a team, if the team had a name, and if that name was, 4 hypotheticals. If that team had a name that a significant number of people found offensive, I'd think about changing it. Now, many people praise that. They said, oh, look, Barack Obama, stuck up for the Indians. He said he changed the name. No, he said he'd think about it. And he also made it into a numbers game. He said, if a significant number of people found it offensive, you know what? In the overall scheme of things, we are not a significant number of people, which is part of the issue. We are a people that have been marginalized in terms of depopulation. Now, how did depopulation happen? Well, L. Frank Baum was calling for our extermination. How the hell do you think it happened? And all of this myth that we somehow just didn't have an immune system, we were a very healthy, solid, sturdy people when white people washed up on our shores looking not so healthy themselves. Our immune systems were fine. Now, Europeans may have been walking petri dishes of all kinds of infectious disease, but it wasn't disease naturally that somehow had eradicated our population. Let's not forget Lord Jeffrey Amherst distributing smallpox blankets to ensure that some of the worst diseases that they had would surely infect us. Let's not forget residential schools, where when it was known to quarantine children who had tuberculosis, that it wasn't done. On the Canadian side, the mortality rate in residential schools was over 50%. So when you ask, well, what happened to that native population? Well, there you go. Disease amongst our people wasn't an accident. It was intentional. In more than one occasion, more than several occasions. Starvation. Poor food. As treaty obligations were failed to be met time and time again by the United States, the conditions of poverty and poor health, those weren't accidents. Those weren't bad luck. Those things happened because of policy, intentional policy. Marginalized people don't happen naturally. People aren't just born in nature to be marginalized. Marginalized people get that way. They're made that way. They are created by force. That's how a people become marginalized. It isn't just, oh, you had the good luck of being born in a wealthy family, or you had the bad luck of being born in poverty. No, that income disparity was created by man. Oh, you can make that deduction. Oh, yeah, you were lucky to be born white in America. Well, that might be the deduction you make now, but how did that become the good fortune? How did white in America become the good fortune? It was made that way. People create disparity. Look, the bad luck of disease, cancer, diabetes, whatever. I mean, some of it's arbitrary. And it isn't because all things happen for a reason. That's a line of bull. Some bad things happen to good people, even to white people. But if you create the conditions where people of color will surely be at a disadvantage in everything from health care to healthy food, the healthy living conditions. Oh yeah, you can do some major things to affect the mortality rate, the life expectancy of people of color. It's not an accident. It's not arbitrary. It's not good luck versus bad luck. It's by design. Yeah, intelligent design isn't about God. It's about people in control who design the systems. It's about people in control who can rig a system that will get a man who commits a murder of a 22-year-old kid completely acquitted. Massage the system. Make it easier. Let it be an all-white jury judging a white man with white lawyers and just a brown face. The presumption when a person of color is killed is that it was justified. It's never the opposite. It's never, the presumption is that it's an unjustifiable homicide. The investigations that do take place, when they take place, it's all about skewing the information to justify the death. Black girl in Texas, Sandra Bland, dies in custody. Nobody questions, well, it's wrong that she died. They figure out, well, how can we make the story work? Eric Garner gets choked out by police, choked to death in Staten Island. No charges against anybody. Look, I'm not saying that there's never a conviction against a person of color, but look at those convictions. Look what happens when a white man commits rape versus a black man commits rape, or is convicted. Not even commits, just convicted. Look what happens when a white man is convicted of drug charges versus a black man or a person of color convicted of drug charges. Look at the difference. The reason we have missing and murdered indigenous women is racism. The reason we can have men murdered and be with all kinds of evidence to suggest that foul play occurred. I mean, the man who killed, I don't want to use the man, the person or whatever that killed Colton Bushy didn't even get charged with, he didn't even get convicted of manslaughter. These cops who kill unarmed individuals, people of color, are almost never convicted. And I have to say almost because one did. One. And the reason is racism. It's the system is controlled and it's geared, it's rigged. So, having expressed my outrage for both missing and murdered indigenous women and the acquittal of the murderer of Colton Bushy, my message is, when do we stop trying to embrace the U.S. and Canada as our countries, as the place that we're somehow ever going to see equity or justice? When do we start incorporating self-reliance more into our game plan, into our strategy to attain a higher quality of life? We're not going to get justice in the U.S. justice system, nor in the Canadian justice system. And justice and equity aren't even the same thing. Oh, we can have conversations about reparations, and we have conversations about apologies and about reconciliation and truth. But none of that's going to affect our quality of life. You know, there's going to be a few Native people running around just with their wheelbarrows ready to fill up money. Oh, reconciliation, yeah, we're going to get reparations. We're going to get money out of this deal. But the vast majority of Native people are still going to live impoverished lives. Jefferson Keel, the president of the NCAI, the National Congress of American Indian, offered his State of Indian Nations address today. The state of Indian nations is strong, is what he said. That's what he said today. And he praised, I don't know how many, 7 tribes in Virginia being granted federal recognition. Granted. Oh, he talked about it being long overdue and that kind of stuff. But it's a grant. It's a gift. He praised them being awarded the gift of federal recognition to be a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. Subordinate to the laws of the United States. No, thank you. We need to stand up. We need to resist. And not just resist the United States. We need to resist each other if the powers that be on our territories believe that our salvation rests in the graciousness of the United States or Canada. Because you know what? Their system isn't working that great for them either, folks. The United States elected Donald Trump, for crying out loud. You think that's going well? You think the United States is living up to its own American dream? Well, then you're buying into the rhetoric. It's time. It's time for us to assert ourselves and stand up for who we are. The racism is an issue if we're relying on those who think they are superior to us. If we are not relying on them, then their view of us doesn't matter as much. So on Wednesday, Valentine's Day, we're declaring it Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Day. Post your pictures of red dresses. And you know what? Don't be afraid to post a picture of a red bandana. Hashtag it, Justice for Colton. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.
Red, blue, go to work every day.